How's it going? I'm Dylan Glatz,
I'm Tarek Lewis.
and we looked at Unfair, the New Science of Criminal Injustice by Adam Benaforta. So he breaks this book up into four different sections. He looks at the investigation, the adjudication, the punishment, and the reform section. So he breaks it up, the entire trial, into four different sections where he looks at different specific individuals that make up the section. So, investigation looks at the victim, the detective, and the suspect, and he uses a bunch of different examples to kind of explain why each has its own bias within it. For the victim, he gave an example about a guy named David Rosenbaum. Prior to when he was known to be David Rosenbaum, he was just a John Doe case where people thought that he was drunk. May have fallen and hit his head, and then they just kind of took a lot of leniency when they went through the procedures. When in actuality, he was hit in the head and had very severe brain trauma. And once they found out that it was David Rosenbaum, who was a writer for the New York Times and for the Washington
Post.
Post, they found out that they started to make more adjustments towards making sure that he was all right when at the time he was already severely injured and ended up dying, which just kind of shows how we take the convenient route whenever possible, even though we should, for everybody, make sure that we take all procedures uh, as cautiously as possible. The second part looks at the detective and how they can force false confessions from people. He used an example about Juan Rivera, where Juan Rivera was charged with rape and murder when in actuality he was not. It was not his fault. They actually had blood tests of other people that they could trace back to actually being their fault. However, they were able to guilt Juan into a false confession because he was just so rattled by the case and everything. And then finally, he talks about the suspect and how we, as just people in general, have a bias where we can look at mugshots and pick out who we think would actually be the convicted criminal, even though there's no reason for us to believe that when we look at somebody, we know exactly who they are. It's kind of like judging a book by its cover. It's not. It does not mean anything. We can't just predict it. It's just something where we start to believe that we could guess who was who.
So then, Section 2 dives into the adjudication process of the trial, and that looks at the lawyer, the jury, the eyewitness, the expert, and the judge. So when they were talking about the lawyer, it gave him the example of how John Thompson was put to death because the opposing lawyer failed to give up a blood sample that would have proven his innocence, and they and they kind of just based it. They kind of made the changes to trials now where they made a law where the lawyer has to give up all evidence in a trial that would help the person that is in trouble. And then the next chapter looks at the jury, and it kind of talks about how it's very hard to base cases off of people like the jury's decision because after all they are inexperienced with the law and stuff, and is it really fair to let people with no legal training or special qualifications decide the outcome of a case? And they use hard conclusive evidence. They believe that it's necessary to help the inexperienced jury come to a decision and make it and aid them in coming to like a hard conclusive decision. And the next chapter, the expert talks about how it brings up Rodney King's case and how the one of the experts on the opposing side of the police convinced the jury that they needed to use excessive force on him when it clearly wasn't necessary. And again, it goes back to how hard evidence is necessary to help a jury decide the outcome of a case. And then the next chapter, the judge dives in and how like certain backgrounds of judges can influence their decision and how we need to kind of have a system where all judges come from the same background to prevent biases from happening. So
And then it goes into punishment, and it looks at how in the past we were more vengeful. We were looking to try and get vengeance for the people that were hurt, whereas now we're trying to be more morally driven. So we're trying to make our decisions based on what our own moral compass says, as opposed to trying to just make sure that the person who may or may not have done something wrong is brought to justice. And then it also looks at the prisoner, where it talks about how the United States has the highest prisoner rate out of any country. We make up less than 5% of the population, but almost 25% of all prisoners around the world.
So then the final section, the reform section, talks a little bit about how we could try to eliminate all the biases that are involved within a criminal trial. And the author, Ben Ferrato, states that when we attempt to justify our bias, it is bias. So, and he kind of just details how the way our current system is that if you're rich and you're connected, you're going to walk regardless of what you did. And if you're poor and you're uneducated, you're going to go to prison. And then the last and final chapter kind of dives into the steps we can take to like prevent biases. And what we need to do is just look at cases from a different perspective, and then we need to reduce the reliance on humans because obviously everyone is biased, and that it's just human nature to be biased, and we need to create a program to help better justice system and make it more consistent all across the board. So all in all, it was a really good book, and if you get to read it, you probably should because it highlights a lot about what is wrong with our justice system and what we need to do in order to fix it. So thank you guys.
Thank you.